In general, how like internet and social media change the landscape, or actually the play for like protesters or ordinary citizens to against like opposing regimes in general?
I guess there's two things. On the one hand, the nature of protest remains very much the same. In other words, when people see injustice, they feel impelled to protest against it. And that's the same what I witnessed as a journalist, for example, in Eastern Europe 20 years ago, or in the protests that we have seen, for example, across North Africa, in Tunisia, Egypt, in recent weeks and months. But technology has also changed things dramatically in being able to make it easier for people to communicate quickly with each other and also to communicate with the outside world. So it was much easier to suppress news of what was happening before an era of mobile phones. Now, of course, in places all around the world where there were no television cameras, but somebody who has their mobile phone can take pictures of that. Those pictures can be seen around the world, and that can create new pressure. So I think there's no question that the new possibilities of the internet, of video, of Facebook, all of these different things give us new opportunities. It is also true that fundamentally protest is protest and injustice is injustice, and that, to be honest, has partly stayed the same.
During all the social media hype, CNET says, don't forget, the real power behind a revolution is the people. Communication is important, but we must remember what lies behind communication, people. This revolution seems determined to get around whatever roadblocks the government instates. Twitter and Facebook and the internet are fun and useful, but this is a revolution fueled by people, not technology.
Like a New York political analyst, I forgot his or her name, has written an article called Why Revolution Cannot Be Tweeted. I don't know whether you have like
right.
Yeah, but 2 months later, we've seen like Libya or like Cairo, that kind of like regions have going to like uprising movement. Do you think it would happen in somewhere else, which and right now having an opposing regime in like near the future?
Yeah. I think it's been a slightly false debate sometimes, to be honest, because one of the arguments made was, well, civil rights protest in the United States back in the 50s and 60s, that was real protest because they were doing it without mobile phones, without anything. They just risked being beaten, risked being arrested, risked their lives. And somehow Facebook or Twitter was seen as being another kind that was just a bunch of comfortable students sitting in their university dorms. Now, there may be some of that, and actually that also has its role to play. But what we saw, especially, for example, in Tunisia and Egypt, in recent weeks and months, was the incredibly important part, to the extent that Facebook started being painted up on the walls, and one of the key heroes of the Egyptian revolution became Wael Ghonim, who worked for Google and who'd set up a Facebook page, and that became the way of communicating. So I think it's not a matter of now we've got new technology, everything's different. It's not. Many things are still the same. But it would also be crazy to suggest that nothing has changed, that Facebook is somehow relevant. Some of the pieces that were written 4, 5, 6 months ago saying Facebook was all just a kind of a bit of an irrelevance, really, to protest. I think it would be very difficult to make that argument now in the wake of what we saw in Tunis and in Cairo.
嚟集會嘅市民喺點幾鐘陸續抵達。到下晝大約1點9，公安突然出動拉人，帶走2名並冇手持茉莉花嘅市民，將佢哋帶上警車。公安企圖阻止記者拍攝。
General situation about like the mode of direct action or whatever, like resistance. Actually, in China, some scholars would say the NGNO, the form of non-governmental, non-organization form of like resistance, like walking around on the streets, would be a new mode to oppose those oppressing regimes. But at the same time, people would question whether it would actually work and putting pressure to the government. What, like, if yes or no, and if not, or if yes, how would it make a difference?
Right. I think there are very, very many different ways of protesting and creating change. One of the things that John Jackson and I tried to do in our book Small Acts of Resistance is to show how many different ways there are of putting on pressure and of creating change. Many of them have in common that they actually create great risks for the individual involved. So this is by no means a how you should do things kind of book. It's more a book of describing of admiration of the risks that people have taken. Extremely interesting to me is to have seen in recent weeks the non-protests, as it were, in Chinese cities where people just go for a walk without slogans. It must be said that's not actually completely new. So in the book, for example, we describe an event from Poland 30 years ago under martial law, tanks on the streets, where people did exactly the same. They protested without any slogans, but people knew that if they went out at a certain time of day, that was the protest. The police didn't know who to arrest. So it's a kind of that sense of ingeniousness. I think it repeats, it develops through different forms of ingeniousness that we see around the world.
Recently, the Premier Wen Jiabao has released the figures of their public security expenses as first time exceeding their military expenses. So, in a nation or in a state that police brutality or the so-called power has been dedicated by the authority to do whatever they want to oppose, to oppress, like these protesters or those are not obeyed to the government. How to tackle this? If to make sure, imagine if you're talking or trying to persuade or advocate an ordinary citizens who are facing this situation.
Yeah. The figures, as you say, are very striking. I guess seeing what we are seeing in China today, perhaps it's not surprising that the public security budget is so immense, because we see it intruding into people's daily lives again and again and again. And not just intruding into their lives, we've seen a great upsurge of arrests in recent weeks of those who put their head above the parapet, and that clearly needs to end. I think the fact of acknowledging quite how high those costs are, one would like to think that should become a wake-up moment, that for no government can it make sense that you spend such an enormous amount in policing your own citizens and basically preventing them from being able to live ordinary lives, to speak the truth in the way that they should be able to communicate with each other as they would be able to, and simply to live ordinary lives. That's something that simply shouldn't happen. It needs to end. I think the fact that we've got the figures merely tells us something we already know, but it does need to change.